Can I borrow you for just one day? The tiny voice drifted across a room where no child had ever been allowed to enter. 5 of New York's most dangerous crime families had gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Moretti estate. Maps of territories covered the polished table. Millions of dollars and hundreds of lives depended on the decisions being made that morning. Then the impossible happened. A little girl in a yellow dress stepped to the towering doors, clutching a purple crayon, as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. Every bodyguard reached for his weapon. Every capo turned toward Alessandro Moretti. The room waited for the inevitable command. Instead, the child ignored everyone else. She stopped directly in front of the most feared mafia boss in New York. Tilting her head with complete innocence, she held up her crayon and asked, "Can I borrow you for just one day?" Silence swallowed the room. No one had ever spoken to Alessandro that way. No one expected him to answer. Yet the decision he made over the next few seconds would change not only his own life, but the fate of everyone standing inside that room. Alessandro Moretti rarely repeated himself. He didn't need to. One glance from him usually ended arguments before they began. This morning was no different. Around the enormous ebony conference table sat the heads of every major faction loyal to the Moretti organization. The atmosphere inside the mansion's council chamber felt heavy enough to suffocate anyone unfamiliar with it. Armed guards stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls. No one smiled. No one relaxed. A projected map of New York glowed across one wall, marked with red circles that represented disputed territory. A rival family had crossed a line 2 nights earlier, and retaliation was already being planned. One careless decision could ignite a war. Alessandro listened quietly as his advisors argued. Some demanded immediate revenge. Others urged patience. He remained expressionless. When Alessandro finally leaned forward, every conversation stopped instantly. "The docks remain ours," he said calmly. "Anyone who forgets that won't make the same mistake twice." Nobody questioned him. They simply nodded. That was how power worked in Alessandro's world. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Just as his chief lieutenant prepared to continue the meeting, the massive wooden doors creaked open. No one had been announced. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Natalie Bennett. Her face had drained of color. She looked as though she wished the marble floor would swallow her whole. Behind her peeked a tiny little girl. Curious brown eyes scanned the enormous room without the slightest hint of fear. Her yellow dress looked almost impossibly bright against the dark wood and black suit surrounding her. She held a single purple crayon tightly in one hand. "Natalie?" One of the house supervisors whispered sharply. "What are you doing?" Natalie rushed forward. "I'm so sorry, Signor Moretti." Her voice shook. "I turned away for 1 second." She slipped out of the kitchen. Grace had already wandered farther into the room. One bodyguard instinctively stepped in front of Alessandro. Grace simply walked around him. Another guard reached down as though to gently stop her. She smiled at him. He hesitated. Before anyone realized what was happening, the little girl stood directly in front of Alessandro's chair. She stared at him with complete fascination. Not fear, not admiration. Simple curiosity. Alessandro looked back at her. The room held its breath. Natalie hurried after her daughter, nearly stumbling over the edge of the carpet. "I'm terribly sorry," she whispered. "I'll take her away immediately." Alessandro lifted one finger. She stopped where she stood. No one moved. Grace glanced at the papers spread across the table. "So many maps," she said quietly. Then she placed her purple crayon on the polished wood. She pushed it toward Alessandro. "I think you forgot your colors." Several men exchanged confused looks. One of the older captains actually blinked twice, unsure whether he was witnessing reality. Alessandro looked at the crayon, then at Grace, then back at the crayon again. It had been years since anyone had offered him anything without expecting something in return. "What is your name?" he asked. The little girl smiled. "Grace." "And how old are you?" She proudly held up 4 fingers. "I'm this many." A few muffled chuckles escaped from the guards before disappearing just as quickly. Natalie's embarrassment only grew. "Please forgive us," she pleaded. "I'll leave my position if I have to." Alessandro didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Grace tracing tiny circles on the table with one finger. She finally looked up again. Her expression was serious. "So," she asked, "can I borrow you for just one day?" The question seemed almost too small for the silence that followed. Several seconds passed. No one dared interrupt. Grace patiently waited for her answer. Alessandro slowly leaned forward until they were eye level. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. If you borrowed me? Grace answered without hesitation. We'd go to the park. She counted on her fingers. Feed birds. Eat strawberry ice cream. You have to push me on the swings. And she thought very hard. Maybe make Mommy laugh. The final words landed harder than any threat spoken during the meeting. Natalie's eyes filled instantly. She lowered her head, hoping no one would notice. Alessandro did. He noticed everything. He looked around the room. Dozens of powerful men waited for instructions. Millions of dollars. Territories. Business. Revenge. All of it suddenly felt strangely unimportant. He stood. Every person in the room immediately rose with him. The meeting is over. Confused expressions spread across the table. One captain cautiously spoke. Senior, the negotiations with the Romano family? They can wait. His lieutenant frowned. The council has been preparing for weeks. Alessandro adjusted the cuff of his jacket. I've just accepted another appointment. The room fell silent once again. He turned toward Grace. What time should I come? Grace's face lit up. Morning. Really early. So we can have the whole day. Alessandro nodded once. Then morning it is. Natalie stared in disbelief. You're serious? I don't make promises lightly. He crouched until he was eye level with Grace. Wore the yellow dress again. She grinned. I was hoping you would say that. For the first time in years, the corners of Alessandro Moretti's mouth lifted into something that looked unmistakably like a smile. No one inside the mansion had ever seen it. As Natalie led Grace toward the doors, the child suddenly turned around. She waved enthusiastically. Don't forget, I borrowed you. I won't, Alessandro replied. The doors slowly closed behind them. The room remained perfectly quiet. None of the men present understood what they had just witnessed. None of them realized that the smallest person in the mansion had accomplished something rival families, assassins, and years of violence never could. She had reached the heart of the man everyone believed no longer had won. The next morning, at precisely 7 o'clock, a black SUV rolled through the wrought iron gates of the Moretti estate. The guard at the entrance barely had time to announce its arrival before the rear door opened, and a little girl in a bright yellow dress skipped onto the long stone driveway, clutching the same purple crayon. She seemed unwilling to leave behind. Grace paused only long enough to wave enthusiastically at the security officers. Good morning, she chirped. The hardened men, whose faces rarely betrayed emotion, looked at one another awkwardly before one of them lifted a hesitant hand in return. Morning, Miss Grace. She beamed as though he had just given her the greatest gift imaginable. Inside the mansion, Natalie hurried after her daughter with an apologetic smile already forming. I'm sorry, she whispered to the nearest housekeeper. She gets excited. Alice, the elderly head housekeeper who had served the Moretti family for nearly 30 years, merely smiled. I think this house could use a little excitement. That was something no one would have dared say only a week earlier. The mansion had always been magnificent. It had never been warm. Its marble halls echoed with footsteps instead of laughter. Conversations were kept short. Every employee understood the unwritten rules. Work quietly. Never disturb Senior Moretti. Never ask unnecessary questions. Never make mistakes. But those rules had begun changing without anyone officially announcing them. Grace was the reason. She wandered through the entrance hall, as though she owned the place, stopping to admire a crystal vase taller than she was. Do flowers get lonely? She asked Rosa, the cook, who happened to be carrying a basket of fresh herbs. Rosa blinked. I suppose they might. Grace frowned thoughtfully. Then they need friends. Before anyone could stop her, she picked a tiny wildflower growing beside the driveway and carefully placed it into the enormous arrangement. There, she said proudly. Now they're happier. Rosa laughed, not politely, not quietly, a real laugh. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd heard one inside these walls. Across the hall, Alessandro watched unnoticed from the staircase. He had intended to head directly to his office. Instead, he found himself standing still, watching. Grace had an extraordinary ability to make ordinary moments feel important. She wasn't impressed by marble floors or priceless paintings. She found greater joy in chasing dust motes dancing through sunlight. She greeted every employee by name after hearing it only once. She thanked people for opening doors. She complimented gardeners on flowers that most guests never even noticed. It was impossible not to smile around her. Alessandro wasn't sure when he'd started smiling back. You're late. Grace looked up dramatically. I am. You said morning. It is morning. She folded her arms. You forgot breakfast first. Alessandro raised an eyebrow. I stand corrected. Within minutes, the dining room, once reserved for silent business breakfasts and tense strategy meetings, echoed with cheerful conversation. Grace insisted everyone taste the pancakes. Even Alessandro. You have to eat the smile one. The smile one? She pointed proudly. I made that pancake. It barely resembled a pancake. More accurately, it looked like an uneven circle with chocolate chips scattered across one side. Alessandro cut off a piece. It's excellent. Natalie covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. She's been practicing. Grace puffed out her cheeks proudly. I'll make better ones when I'm 5. The staff exchanged glances. Their boss, the man who once dismissed chefs for overcooked steak, was happily eating a burnt pancake made by a 4-year-old. No one could quite believe it. Later that afternoon, Alessandro attempted to review contracts in his office. Grace wandered in carrying a stack of blank paper almost as large as herself. I'm decorating. My office. Our office. Before Alessandro could object, she climbed onto a chair and began drawing colorful suns, smiling clouds, flowers with impossibly long stems, and tiny stick figures wearing oversized suits. What is this one? Alessandro asked. She pointed. That's you. He studied the drawing. The hair is very accurate. Grace giggled. And that's Mommy. A smaller figure stood beside him. And that's me. The 3 stick figures held hands beneath a giant yellow sun. Alessandro stared at the picture longer than he intended. He realized something uncomfortable. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had drawn him smiling. Grace carefully taped the picture beside the bookshelf. There. It looked lonely. He said nothing. He simply let it stay. By evening, even the security team had begun anticipating Grace's visits. She insisted on greeting every guard before leaving. She learned which one secretly liked chocolate, which one had a daughter, which one couldn't whistle. To Grace, none of them were bodyguards. They were simply her friends. Natalie noticed the changes too. Employees no longer rushed through corridors with anxious expressions. People lingered to talk. The gardeners whistled while trimming hedges. Music drifted from the kitchen. Someone had even placed fresh flowers throughout the mansion without being instructed. It no longer felt like a fortress. It felt alive. As the sun dipped below the estate walls, Natalie found Alessandro standing alone on the rear terrace overlooking the gardens. Grace was chasing butterflies across the lawn with 2 amused gardeners, pretending they couldn't catch her. Natalie joined him quietly. I've never seen this place like this. Neither have I, Alessandro admitted. She glanced toward her daughter. I'm sorry if she's becoming a distraction. He shook his head. She's becoming a reminder. A reminder of what? He watched Grace burst into delighted laughter after a butterfly escaped her tiny hands. That life isn't supposed to be spent preparing for tomorrow's battles. Natalie looked at him with quiet surprise. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace suddenly ran back toward the terrace, holding a tiny white daisy she'd picked from a garden. She stretched as high as she could. This is for you. Alessandro accepted the flower as carefully as if it were made of glass. You know, Grace said thoughtfully, flowers only grow where people take care of them. Then she skipped away again before either adult could answer. Alessandro looked down at the small daisy resting in his hand. Around him, the mansion buzzed with sounds it had almost forgotten. Laughter from the kitchen, cheerful conversation in the corridors, and the carefree giggle of a little girl who had unknowingly accomplished what years of power, wealth, and fear never could. Without firing a single shot or issuing a single command, Grace Bennett had begun conquering the coldest place Alessandro Moretti had ever built, his home, and slowly his heart. Natalie had always believed that peace was something borrowed, never owned. Every morning she woke before sunrise, not because a mansion demanded it, but because years of fear had trained her body to expect danger before daylight. She checked the locks on the small apartment the Moretti estate provided for senior staff. She looked through the curtains before opening them. She listened for unfamiliar footsteps outside her door. Only after convincing herself that everything was quiet did she wake Grace with a kiss on the forehead. Grace, blissfully unaware of the habits born from trauma, stretched sleepily and smiled. Are we going to see Mr. Alessandro today? Natalie brushed a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. If he's not too busy. He always makes time now. The innocence in Grace's voice warmed Natalie and frightened her in equal measure. People like Alessandro Moretti rarely changed, and when they did, the world noticed. That afternoon, while Grace sat beneath the old oak tree in the estate gardens drawing another colorful masterpiece. Natalie worked quietly beside Alice in the laundry room. Fresh linen steamed from the pressing table. The comforting scent of lavender soap filled the air. Alice folded a towel before glancing toward Natalie. She brought light back into this house. Natalie smiled faintly. She has a way of doing that. And you spent years trying to keep that light alive. Natalie's hands paused. Alice had served the Moretti family longer than almost anyone. She noticed things other people overlooked. You don't have to answer, Alice continued gently, but I've seen that look before. What look? The look of someone who still expects yesterday to come knocking. Natalie lowered her eyes. For several moments, only the hiss of steam filled the room. My husband wasn't a bad man, she finally said. Alice remained silent, letting the words come naturally. He repaired delivery trucks for a small company in Queens. He never carried a gun, never owed anyone money. He loved making Grace laugh. Her voice trembled slightly. One night, he was driving home after working late. She swallowed hard. There was a shooting at an intersection. Alice's folding slowed. The bullets weren't meant for him. Natalie nodded. He happened to stop at the wrong traffic light. Her fingers tightened around the towel she was holding. He died before the ambulance arrived. Alice quietly reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm so sorry. Natalie forced a smile that never reached her eyes. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. She shook her head. A few days later, strange men came asking questions. What kind of questions? They wanted to know whether he'd seen something before he died. Alice frowned. But he was innocent. So was I. Natalie's voice dropped to almost a whisper. They didn't care. She stared toward the window where Grace's laughter drifted inside on the afternoon breeze. I packed one suitcase. I took Grace, and we disappeared. Alice looked at her with growing concern. You've been running ever since. Natalie gave a tiny nod. I changed cities twice. I changed jobs. I stopped making friends. I stopped telling anyone where we lived. Her eyes shimmered. I thought they'd eventually stop looking. Outside, Grace laughed as one of the gardeners pretended to lose a race against her. Natalie watched the scene with quiet longing. For the first time in years, she whispered, she finally feels safe. Neither woman noticed the groundskeeper entering through the rear door. Miss Bennett. He held a small white envelope. They found this tucked beneath the windshield wiper of your car. Natalie's smile disappeared instantly. I don't recognize it. There wasn't a stamp. No name. No return address. The room suddenly felt colder. She accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper was cheap, unremarkable. Whoever had delivered it hadn't wanted attention. Alice frowned. Open it. Natalie carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. Only 5 words were written in thick black marker. We know where you are. Her knees weakened. Alice caught her before she could fall. Natalie? The color drained completely from her face. No. She whispered. No. No. Alice looked at the message, her expression darkening. Who sent this? Natalie couldn't answer. She already knew, or at least she knew who it had to be. The people she'd spent 4 years hiding from had finally caught up. At that very moment, Grace came running through the doorway, proudly holding another drawing. Mommy. She stopped when she saw her mother's frightened expression. What's wrong? Natalie forced the paper behind her back. Nothing, sweetheart. Grace tilted her head. You look like you're going to cry. Before Natalie could respond, another voice came from the doorway. What happened? Alessandro stood there, having arrived after hearing the commotion. His sharp eyes immediately moved from Natalie's pale face to the crumpled envelope in her shaking hand. Without asking permission, he stepped closer. May I? Natalie hesitated before handing him the note. His expression remained unreadable as he scanned the message once. Then again, the room became perfectly silent. When did this arrive? A few minutes ago, the groundskeeper answered. Alessandro turned the envelope over in his hands. No fingerprints. Delivered by hand. Someone wanted to make sure she'd see it. He looked toward the nearest security camera, mounted outside the window. Pull every recording from the last 12 hours. One guard immediately hurried away. Another appeared almost instantly after hearing Alessandro's command. Double the security around the estate. No one enters without my approval. Yes, Senior. Grace quietly slipped her tiny hand into Alessandro's. Is Mommy in trouble? He looked down at the little girl. His voice softened. No, but someone made her afraid. Grace frowned. I don't like people who make my mommy afraid. Alessandro gently squeezed her hand. Neither do I. His eyes lifted to Natalie. There was no anger in them, only quiet determination. You should have told me. Natalie lowered her gaze. I didn't want to bring my problems into your home. Alessandro looked around the mansion that had once been a fortress. They already have. He folded the threatening note once and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Whoever sent this has made one very serious mistake. Natalie looked at him anxiously. What mistake? His expression hardened into the one that had built the Moretti empire. They've reminded me that you're no longer running alone. Outside, evening settled over the estate. But somewhere beyond the gates, unseen eyes had already begun watching. The peace Grace had brought into the mansion had not gone unnoticed. And for the first time in years, the shadows from Natalie's past had found their way home. The threatening note remained folded inside Alessandro Moretti's jacket long after everyone else had gone back to work. He had read countless ransom demands, assassination warnings, and declarations of war over the years. None of them unsettled him the way 5 handwritten words had. We know where you are. It wasn't because he feared for himself. It was because he had seen the terror in Natalie's eyes. That fear wasn't new. It belonged to someone who had spent years expecting the past to catch up with her. As evening settled over the estate, the mansion was quieter than usual. Grace had fallen asleep on a window seat in the library, her purple crayon still loosely clutched in one hand and an unfinished drawing resting on her lap. Alessandro carefully lifted the paper before it slipped to the floor. 3 stick figures stood beneath an oversized yellow sun. One wore a dress. One had long hair. The third wore what looked suspiciously like a suit and tie. Above them, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Our happy day." He stared at the drawing longer than he intended. "You can keep it." Natalie's soft voice came from the doorway. He looked up to find her standing there, her hands nervously clasped together. "I was going to frame it for you someday." Alessandro set the drawing gently on the table. "She draws us together every time." Natalie smiled sadly, because that's how she sees the world. She walked over to Grace, brushing a loose curl away from her daughter's face, before pulling a blanket over her tiny shoulders. "I've spent years trying to protect that innocence." Alessandro waited quietly. Something told him she was finally ready to tell him what had remained hidden. Natalie looked toward the rain-speckled windows. "The day Grace asked if she could borrow you." Her voice caught for a moment. It wasn't something she planned. Alessandro listened without interrupting. "A few nights before that meeting, she woke up while I thought she was asleep." Natalie lowered her eyes. I was sitting beside her bed. I didn't realize she could hear me. She drew a slow breath. "I was praying." Alessandro's expression softened. "I asked God to give my daughter just one happy day." She smiled through tears. "One day where she wouldn't have to watch me worry about money. One day where she wouldn't hear me crying after she fell asleep. One day where she wouldn't feel afraid every time someone knocked on the door." Silence filled the room. I thought she was dreaming. Natalie laughed quietly through her tears, but she remembered every word. Alessandro slowly glanced toward the sleeping child. "The next morning," Natalie continued, "she asked me what kind of person could make a whole day feel happy. And what did you tell her?" "I told her." Natalie hesitated. "Someone strong. Someone who keeps promises. Someone who makes other people feel safe." Her eyes met Alessandro's. "I never mentioned your name. But Grace had watched you from the hallways. She saw how everyone listened when you spoke. She saw how no one dare hurt people under your protection." Natalie smiled sadly. In her little mind, you were the strongest person in the world. Alessandro felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. So she wasn't borrowing me for herself. Natalie shook her head. No, she wanted to borrow safety. The word struck harder than any bullet ever had. She believed, Natalie whispered, that if she could borrow you for one day, then I could finally rest. Alessandro looked at Grace again. The little girl shifted slightly in her sleep, hugging her crayon against her chest. A child, for years old, carrying worries no child should ever know. "I've failed her," Natalie said quietly. "You protected her," Alessandro corrected, "as best you could." "For years," she admitted, "but I can't keep running forever." The room grew still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Alessandro walked to the fireplace, staring into the fading flames before speaking. "When I was young, my father told me that power exists for one reason. Natalie waited. To protect those who cannot protect themselves. A bitter smile crossed his face. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. He turned back toward her. The note changes nothing. Natalie looked confused. It changes everything, she said. They found us. They found you, Alessandra replied calmly. But they found you here. He stepped closer. As long as you're inside these walls, no one touches you. His voice carried the quiet certainty that had built an empire. No one threatens Grace. No one threatens you. And no one will force either of you to run again. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. She could no longer hold back. You can't promise that. I already have. She searched his face for hesitation. There was none, only unwavering resolve. You asked me why I agreed to spend one day with Grace. Natalie nodded. I didn't know the answer then. He looked toward the sleeping child. I do now. He carefully picked up Grace's drawing and held it in both hands. She reminded me what strength is actually for. He looked back at Natalie. You and Grace came here believing you were borrowing one day of safety. His voice became firm. You were wrong. Natalie frowned. What do you mean? A faint smile appeared on Alessandro's face. You don't have one day. You have my word. And unlike the men hunting you, I never break my promises. Morning sunlight spilled to the tall windows of the Moretti estate, washing the marble floors in a warmth the mansion had not known in years. Somewhere down the hallway, Grace's laughter echoed so freely that even the portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed less intimidating. Alessandro paused outside his office, listening. You missed. Grace squealed with delight as one of the bodyguards deliberately failed to catch the soft cloth ball she had tossed toward him. I was distracted, the guard protested with exaggerated seriousness. By what? You're very impressive throwing. Grace giggled. You're pretending. I would never. Another burst of laughter filled the corridor. Only weeks ago, no one would have imagined armed men assigned to protect one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York willingly playing games with a 4-year-old before breakfast. Alessandro found himself smiling. You look happier. He turned to find Vincenzo standing beside him, a polished car, key twirling between his fingers. The elderly driver had spent more than 2 decades serving the Moretti family. Few people knew Alessandro well enough to notice changes in him. I've been told that several times. Because it's true. Vincenzo nodded toward the hallway. She has changed this house. Alessandro watched Grace triumphantly declare herself the winner of a game whose rules seemed to change every minute. No, he said quietly. She's changing me. The word surprised even him. Later that morning, Alessandro called an unexpected meeting. His advisors entered the conference room, expecting discussions about territory or rival families. Instead, they found architectural drawings spread across the enormous walnut table. One captain frowned. Senior? Alessandro looked around the room. How many businesses does the Moretti family own legally? The men exchanged puzzled glances. Shipping, construction, hotels, a security company, and several restaurants, another replied. Alessandro nodded thoughtfully. Expand them. Silence followed. The construction division needs new contracts. The hotels should become our priority. I want investments in schools, housing, and community development. One advisor blinked. What about everything else? Alessandro closed the folder in front of him. We've spent years building an empire people fear. His voice remained calm. It's time we build one they're proud to live beside. The room fell silent. No one argued. Yet every man understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Their boss wasn't talking about winning another war. He was talking about creating a future beyond one. When the meeting ended, Alessandro wandered into the gardens. Grace sat beneath the old oak tree, arranging tiny stones into a crooked circle. What are you building? A castle. He crouched beside her. It needs more towers. She handed him a pebble. You help. For the next 20 minutes, the most feared man in New York carefully balanced stones under the watchful supervision of a 4-year-old architect. It fell down. Alessandro observed after the little tower collapsed. Grace shrugged. Then we build it better. Her answer lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps that was true of more than castles. Natalie watched him from the veranda while trimming fresh flowers for the dining room. Alice stepped beside her carrying a basket of herbs. I've never seen him sit on the grass before. Natalie smiled softly. I don't think he has. They watched Alessandro patiently accept instructions from Grace, as though she were negotiating an important business deal. That one goes there, Grace insisted. Understood. No, she laughed. Not like that. He moved the stone again. Better? She nodded with great satisfaction. You're learning. Natalie couldn't stop smiling. The story she'd heard about Alessandro Moretti painted him as ruthless, untouchable, and incapable of mercy. Yet the man sitting beneath the oak tree looked nothing like the legend whispered throughout New York's underworld. He listened before speaking. He encouraged instead of intimidating. He celebrated every tiny success Grace achieved as though it truly mattered. For the first time, Natalie realized something she had never considered before. Perhaps kindness had never disappeared from him. Perhaps it had simply been buried beneath years of responsibility, grief, and violence. Grace suddenly abandoned the castle and ran toward Natalie. Mommy! She threw her arms around her mother's waist before pointing back toward Alessandro. Do you know something? What is it? Grace lowered her voice as though sharing a magnificent secret. He's my favorite grown-up. Natalie's eyes drifted toward Alessandro. He pretended not to hear, but the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. Your favorite? Natalie teased. Grace nodded enthusiastically. Because he keeps promises. She counted on her fingers. He listens. He shares his pancakes. He lets me draw in his office. And she looked back toward Alessandro. He makes you smile again. Natalie's breath caught. Children often notice truths adults try to hide. She hadn't realized how long it had been since smiling had come naturally. That evening, Alessandro stood alone in his office. Grace's colorful drawings covered one corner of the wall. A tiny daisy she'd given him rested in a glass of water, beside stacks of business reports. On his desk lay two folders. One detailed the expansion of legitimate companies. The other contained plans for reducing the family's criminal operations over the coming years. He looked from one folder to the other before quietly closing the second on top of first. For the first time in decades, the future he imagined was measured not by power or territory, but by something far simpler. A little girl laughing in the garden. A mother no longer afraid to sleep through the night. And a home that finally felt like a place where life could begin instead of a fortress built to survive it. Night settled heavily over the Moretti estate. From the outside, the mansion looked as untouchable as ever, its towering gates guarded by armed men and watched by dozens of cameras. Inside, however, the atmosphere had quietly changed. Grace's drawing still decorated Alessandro's office wall. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases throughout the halls. Laughter had become as common as footsteps. Not everyone welcomed the transformation. From the shadows beyond the estate walls, a black sedan remained parked beneath a row of cypress trees. Its headlights were off. Inside, a man lowered a pair of binoculars. There she is. Across the seat beside him sat another man whose expensive suit barely concealed a scar running from his temple to his jaw. Don Victor Romano, leader of the Romano crime family, studied the photographs spread across his lap. One showed Grace chasing butterflies. Another captured Natalie laughing for the first time in years. The final photograph showed Alessandro kneeling beside the little girl as they built a tiny stone castle beneath the old oak tree. Romano smiled without warmth. So the stories are true. The great Alessandro Moretti finally has a weakness. The man with the binoculars nodded. Our source inside the estate confirmed everything. Romano looked toward him. Is he trustworthy? He has served Moretti for years. He knows the estate better than anyone, and he's tired of watching his boss throw away everything they built. Romano leaned back, arranged a meeting. The following evening, beneath the abandoned warehouse district along the East River, two black SUVs stopped several yards apart. No bodyguards accompanied the men who stepped out. Trust did not exist here. Only temporary alliances. Marco Ricci adjusted the collar of his dark coat before walking toward Romano. For nearly 15 years, Marco had stood beside Alessandro Moretti. He had survived wars, negotiated peace, protected the Moretti Empire with unquestioning loyalty. Or so everyone believed. You kept me waiting, Romano said. Marco remained expressionless. I had to leave without attracting attention. Romano chuckled. Your boss is becoming distracted. He spends afternoons drawing pictures. He cancels meetings for playground visits. I almost feel sorry for him. Marco's face remained unreadable. What do you want? I want what you've always wanted. Romano slowly lit a cigar. The Moretti Empire. Smoke curled into the cold night air. And you know something? He smiled. I don't think Alessandro wants it anymore. Marco said nothing. Silence often revealed more than conversation. Romano stepped closer. Men like Alessandro don't retire. They become vulnerable. They hesitate. They choose family over business. And then, he snapped his fingers. They lose everything. Marco finally spoke. He's planning to reduce operations. Romano's smile widened. I know. He thinks legitimacy will protect him. It won't. The older crime boss looked toward the river. The moment he starts dismantling his organization, ambitious men will begin choosing sides. And you've already chosen yours. Marco's jaw tightened. I built that empire with him. I buried friends for it. I sacrificed my own family. His voice carried years of quiet resentment. Now a child walks into his life, and suddenly none of it matters. Romano watched him carefully. There it is. The truth. Marco looked away. I gave Alessandro my loyalty. He gave his heart to someone else. Neither man needed to say Grace's name. They both understood. Romano reached into his coat and placed a photograph on the hood of the SUV. Grace and Natalie stood outside a small bookstore near the estate, smiling over a bag of children's books. Marco stared at the picture. What are you suggesting? Romano's answer came calmly. We don't attack Alessandro. We take away the reason he's changing. Marco's eyes narrowed. A child. A bargaining piece, Romano corrected. No one has to die. We simply convince Alessandro that some dreams cost too much. And if he refuses? Romano shrugged. Then the Moretti Empire falls with him. The river wind carried an uneasy silence between them. Marco looked once more at the photograph. For the first time in years, Alessandro had begun speaking about peace instead of revenge, about schools instead of smuggling, about families instead of fear. Everything they had fought to build was changing. Marco could no longer recognize the man he had once admired. Slowly, he picked up the photograph. What do you need from me? Romano smiled. Schedules, security rotations, Grace's routines. Nothing more. Marco slipped the photograph into his coat pocket. You'll have them. They shook hands once. Briefly. Neither trusted the other. Neither intended the partnership to last longer than necessary. But both understood they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Back at the estate, completely unaware of the agreement being forged in darkness, Grace sat cross-legged on the library floor. She proudly held up another drawing. Mr. Alessandro. He looked up from a stack of business reports. Yes, I made our family bigger. He smiled. Did you? She nodded enthusiastically. You, Mommy, me. She pointed to two more smiling stick figures. And Alice. And Vincenzo. Because families can keep growing. Alessandro laughed softly. I think you're right. Grace carefully taped the drawing beside the others. Neither of them noticed the figure, standing silently in the hallway. Marco watched the scene for only a few seconds. His expression never changed. Then he turned away and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor, carrying with him the first pieces of information that would soon place the little girl who had taught the mansion to smile directly in the sights of its enemies. The following Tuesday began like every other peaceful morning. Grace insisted on wearing the yellow backpack Natalie had bought from a discount store months earlier because, according to her, yellow is the happiest color. She skipped across the front steps of the estate with one hand wrapped around Natalie's fingers and the other clutching a folded drawing she planned to give her teacher. Alessandro was already waiting beside the black SUV. He had gradually made it a habit to see Grace off before his meetings. Inspection, he announced with exaggerated seriousness. Grace stood perfectly still while he pretended to examine her backpack. Lunch. She nodded. Packed. Homework. She patted the bag proudly. Finished. Purple crayon? She gasped dramatically. I almost forgot. She reached into her pocket and proudly produced a familiar crayon. There. Alessandro smiled. Now you're ready. Grace hugged him tightly around the waist. Bye, favorite grown-up. Natalie couldn't help smiling. We'll be back this afternoon. I'll be here, Alessandro replied. As the SUV disappeared to the estate gates, he watched until it vanished around the bend. He didn't know why an uneasy feeling lingered long after it was gone. School ended at 3 o'clock. Children poured to the front entrance laughing, waving goodbye to teachers, and racing toward waiting parents. Natalie stood near the curb, searching the crowd. Every afternoon, Grace spotted her first. Every afternoon, she came running. Today, she didn't. Natalie checked the entrance again, then the playground, then the parking lot. Her smile slowly disappeared. A teacher approached. Mrs. Bennett? Yes. Didn't Grace leave with you? Natalie's heartbeat stumbled. No, I've been waiting here. The teacher frowned. I saw her walking toward a black SUV. Natalie's blood turned cold. A black SUV? Yes. I assumed it belonged to your family. It doesn't. Her voice barely came out. What man? The teacher searched her memory. Tall, dark suit. He told Grace that Mr. Alessandro had sent him because there was a surprise waiting. Natalie felt the world tilt beneath her feet. No, she whispered. No. She was already running before the teacher could say another word. The gates of the Moretti estate burst open 20 minutes later. Natalie's car barely stopped before she threw herself out. Alessandro. Her scream echoed across the courtyard. House staff froze. Bodyguards reached for weapons instinctively. Alessandro stepped out of the mansion just as Natalie stumbled toward him, breathless and pale. Grace. She could barely speak. They took her. The word struck like a gunshot. Alessandro caught her before she collapsed. What happened? They said you sent someone. They told her there was a surprise. She believed them. Her voice shattered. She's gone. For one long second, everything became perfectly still. Then Alessandro's face changed. The warmth Grace had awakened disappeared behind the expression that had once made an entire criminal empire obey without question. His voice became ice. Locked the estate. Within seconds, alarms echoed across the property. Steel security gates slammed shut. Bodyguards sprinted to their assigned positions. Find Marco. One guard hesitated. Senior, Marco has reported in since this morning. Alessandro slowly turned. When was the last time anyone saw him? No one knows. A terrible silence followed. The pieces fell into place. The threatening note, the missing captain, the false message at the school, betrayal. Natalie grabbed Alessandro's sleeve. You promised. Tears streamed down her face. You promised you wouldn't have to run anymore. His jaw tightened. I know. You promised. I know. His voice remained calm, but every person standing nearby recognized the fury beneath it. He turned toward a security chief. I want every road leaving Manhattan monitored. Call every contact at the ports. Close the bridges if necessary. Search every warehouse, every safe house, every abandoned property connected to Romano. Yes, Senior. Another captain stepped forward. Our legitimate companies. I don't care. Cancel every meeting. Ground every shipment. Every man loyal to this family has one assignment. He looked each of them in the eye. Bring Grace home. Phones immediately began ringing throughout the estate. Orders spread across New York like wildfire. Construction supervisors abandoned job sites. Truck drivers changed routes. Security teams left office buildings. Former soldiers, private investigators, dock workers, mechanics, restaurant owners. Every legitimate business connected to the Moretti organization quietly became part of a citywide search. For the first time in years, the entire empire moved with one purpose that had nothing to do with money or power. Finding one little girl. Natalie sank onto marble steps, clutching Grace's forgotten water bottle against her chest. I should have held her hand. She sobbed. I should have never let her out of my sight. Alessandro knelt beside her. This isn't your fault. I failed her. No. His voice was firm. The people who took Grace planned this. He looked toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered over the city skyline. They lied to a child because they were too afraid to face me. A bodyguard hurried across the courtyard, carrying a small evidence bag. We found this outside the school. Inside was a single purple crayon. Its paper wrapper was torn where tiny fingers had held it countless times. Grace had dropped it. Or perhaps she had left it. Alessandro carefully took the crayon into his hand. His fingers closed around it. They want my empire, he said quietly. They've made one fatal mistake. Every man in the courtyard waited. Alessandro looked at the little purple crayon, then toward the city that had feared his name for decades. They didn't steal my weakness. His voice carried across the silent estate. They stole my family. And for the first time in many years, New York was about to remember exactly why the name Alessandro Moretti had once been spoken in whispers. Rain hammered the rooftops of Brooklyn as darkness swallowed the abandoned shipping district. Lightning flashed across the East River, briefly illuminating rows of rusting warehouses that had once stored cargo from every corner of the world. Most had stood empty for years. Tonight, one of them glowed faintly from within. A convoy of black SUVs rolled silently to a stop several hundred yards away. Their headlights remained off. Engines died one after another. Dozens of armed men stepped into the rain without speaking. Alessandro Moretti stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. A phone in his hand displayed the grainy ransom video they had received less than an hour earlier. Grace sat tied to a wooden chair, frightened but unharmed. Behind her, Don Victor Romano had smiled into the camera. You have until midnight. No police. No tricks. Bring the deeds to your empire. And perhaps the little girl goes home. The video ended. Alessandro slipped the phone into his pocket. They chose the wrong bargaining chip. His security chief unfolded a blueprint across the hood of an SUV. Thermal drones confirmed 12 armed men inside. Romano is on the second floor. There are explosives near the east exit. And Grace? The answer came quietly. Ground level. Center room. Alessandro nodded once. No one fires near the child. His men answered together. Yes, Senor. A cold wind swept across the docks. Alessandro looked at his watch. 11:48. 12 minutes until midnight. He lifted one hand. The assault began. 2 teams slipped through broken loading doors, while another climbed fire escapes leading to the upper windows. The first guard barely had time to turn before he was quietly disarmed. Another reached for his radio. Too late. Within seconds, the outer perimeter belonged to the Moretti family. Then everything exploded into chaos. Gunfire shattered the silence. Bullets ripped through broken glass. Men scattered behind steel containers. Romano's soldiers returned fire from the catwalks above. Protect the stairs. Someone shouted. Alessandro moved through the warehouse with frightening precision. Every movement was calm. Every shot deliberate. Years of surviving gang wars had taught him how to fight without hesitation. One by one, Romano's men fell back. Near the center of the warehouse, Grace heard the gunfire and squeezed her eyes shut. She remembered something Alessandro had once told her while teaching her to play hide and seek. If you're scared, stay where you are. I'll come find you. She whispered those words to herself again and again. I'll stay. I'll stay. You'll find me. Upstairs, Don Romano backed toward the office, overlooking the warehouse floor. Marco Ricci stood beside him, gripping a pistol with trembling hands. You said we'd have time. Romano glared at him. I didn't expect him to attack this fast. Footsteps echoed up the metal staircase. Slow, measured, unhurried, Alessandro appeared through the drifting smoke. Rainwater dripped from his coat. His expression was colder than either man had ever seen. His eyes settled on Marco. So, he said quietly, it was you. Marco lowered his weapon slightly. I built your empire. I gave you everything. And you threw away for a child. Alessandro took another step. I remembered something you forgot. Marco laughed bitterly. No, you became weak. You chose bedtime stories over power. You chose pancakes over respect. I chose family. The words echoed through the warehouse. Marco's face hardened. You don't deserve either. He raised his pistol. Before he could pull the trigger, Alessandro fired once. The weapon flew from Marco's hand, skidding across the floor. Marco collapsed, clutching his wounded shoulder. Romano seized a moment and reached for a detonator lying on the desk. If I lose everything, no one leaves alive. His thumb hovered over the switch. A single gunshot rang out. The detonator slipped from Romano's fingers. He stared in disbelief at the spreading stain across his chest before collapsing beside the shattered window. The device tumbled harmlessly across the floor. Alessandro kicked it away. He didn't wait to watch Romano fall. He was already running downstairs. Smoke drifted through the warehouse. Broken lights flickered overhead. Grace. His voice echoed through the darkness. A tiny voice answered almost immediately. I'm here. Relief surged through him. He followed the sound to the center of the room. Grace sat exactly where the kidnappers had left her. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her chin remained lifted with determined courage. I stayed. She sniffled. Just like you said. Alessandro dropped to one knee and quickly untied the ropes around her wrists. The moment she was free, she threw herself into his arms with all the strength her little body possessed. You came. I promise. She buried her face against his shoulder. I knew you would. Behind them, flames suddenly burst along the eastern wall. One of Romano's damaged fuel drums had ignited. The fire spread rapidly. Senor, a bodyguard shouted. We have to move. Alessandro lifted Grace into his arms. She wrapped both arms tightly around his neck. As they hurried toward the exit, Grace looked at him through tear-filled eyes. I was so scared. He held her a little closer. I know, but you're safe now. Outside. The rain poured harder, hissing against a growing fire behind them. Natalie broke through the line of bodyguards the instant she saw them. Grace. She ran into Alessandro's arms as he lowered her daughter to the ground. Mother and child clung to each other, both sobbing uncontrollably. Grace looked up through her tears, reached for Alessandro's hand, and refused to let go. You kept your promise, she whispered. Alessandro looked at the little purple crayon still tucked safely inside his jacket pocket. For the first time in years, victory meant nothing to him. Power meant nothing. Standing in the rain, with Grace holding one hand and Natalie standing beside them, he realized he hadn't rescued only a frightened little girl that night. He had rescued the future he had finally found the courage to believe in. Dawn broke quietly over the Moretti estate. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there were no gunshots echoing across the city, no urgent phone calls demanding retaliation, and no reports waiting on Alessandro Moretti's desk. The smoke from a warehouse had disappeared into memory, leaving only the scars it had carved into everyone who had survived the longest night of their lives. Grace had refused to leave Alessandro's side since they returned. Even after falling asleep in the hospital for a few hours while doctors confirmed she was unharmed, she woke looking for only two people, her mother and Alessandro. Now she sat beside him on a bench overlooking the mansion gardens, wrapped in a soft blanket, while the morning breeze stirred the flowers blooming beneath the old oak tree. She rested her head against his arm. You stayed. Alessandro smiled gently. I told you I would. She thought about that for a moment. You always keep your promises. I try to. Grace looked down at her little hands before speaking again. When the bad men took me, she hesitated. I wasn't brave. He turned toward her. You were? I cried. So would anyone. I was scared. So was I. She looked surprised. You were? Alessandro nodded. I've faced dangerous men my whole life, but nothing has ever frightened me the way losing you did. Grace quietly reached for his hand. She squeezed it with all the strength a 4-year-old could manage. Then she asked a question that neither he nor Natalie would ever forget. Can I keep you instead of borrowing you? Time seemed to stand still. Alessandro looked at the little girl whose simple request had changed every part of his life. The frightened child who had only wanted to give her exhausted mother one peaceful day had somehow given him something far greater, hope. Before he could answer, Natalie stepped onto the terrace, carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate. She stopped when she saw the tears quietly gathering in Alessandro's eyes. Grace looked up at him expectantly. Well, a soft laugh escaped him. I was wondering when you'd ask. He opened his arms. Grace immediately climbed into his lap. You never had to borrow me. He kissed the top of her head. I'm exactly where I belong. Natalie wiped away a tear before joining them on the bench. For several peaceful minutes, none of them spoke. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like home. Later that afternoon, every senior member of the Moretti organization gathered inside the same conference room, where Grace had first walked through the doors carrying her purple crayon. The walnut table remained. The leather chairs remained. But something fundamental had changed. Alessandro stood at the head of the room. His captains waited for instructions. Many expected retaliation against the remnants of Romano's organization. Others anticipated another expansion of territory. Instead, Alessandro placed a single folder on the table. Our war is over. Confused murmurs spread across the room. He continued calmly. Effective immediately, every remaining criminal operation under my authority will be shut down or transferred to legitimate ownership. One captain stared in disbelief. Senior, Alessandro raised a hand. The shipping company stays. The construction business expands. Our hotels, restaurants, and security firms continue. The rest ends today. Another advisor frowned. Our enemies will think we're weak. They're welcome to. His voice never rose. I spent years believing fear was the greatest legacy a man could leave behind. He looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. I was wrong. Silence settled over the gathering. The strongest empire is the one that no longer needs violence to survive. Some men lowered their heads. Others smiled quietly. A few stood and applauded, not because their boss had ordered them to, because they understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. When the meeting ended, Alessandro walked into gardens where Natalie and Grace were waiting beneath the old oak tree. Workers had begun removing old security barriers around the flower beds. Children from a nearby community center laughed, while planting new trees, part of the first charitable project funded by the Moretti Foundation. Grace ran toward Alessandro, carrying one final drawing. This one's finished. He unfolded the paper carefully. 3 smiling figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. Behind them was the old oak tree. Around them were flowers, birds, and children playing. Across the top, written in uneven purple letters, were the words, "My Forever Family." Alessandro felt his throat tighten. Without a word, he knelt before Grace. "I have something for you, too." From his jacket pocket, he removed the purple crayon she had unknowingly left behind at her school the day she was taken. "I think this belongs to its artist." Grace's face lit up. "You kept it." "I'll always keep what reminds me of where my life truly began." She hugged him fiercely. Natalie slipped her hand into his. For the first time since arriving at the estate, there was no fear in her eyes, only peace. The afternoon sun bathed the gardens in golden light, as laughter drifted across the grounds once ruled by silence. The mansion that had once stood as a monument of power had become a place where kindness was welcomed, promises were kept, and love was never mistaken for weakness. Years later, people throughout New York would remember Alessandro Moretti in many different ways. Some would recall the feared man who once controlled the city's underworld. Others would speak of the businessman who transformed neighborhoods and gave countless families new beginnings. But one little girl will remember him more simply than anyone else ever could. Not as a mafia boss, not as a legend, not even as a hero, just as the favorite grown-up she had once asked to borrow for a single day and who chose to stay forever.